Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Reptilian Overlords Arcana podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to invite you beyond the threshold of the known and the unknown. My name is Nate.
And I am Nicole. Today we're going to be taking this in a more abstract direction. We're going to be talking about the meta-themes that color and define this stuff. We're going to be talking about metaphysics, epistemology, ontology, with the paranormal in general.
So, in a sense, this project is about reptilians, but that's not really ultimately everything that it is about.
Yeah, so this project encompasses a wide range of phenomenology. Everything from ufology, psychedelia, and paranormal, to cross-cultural studies of esotericism and other fringe countercultural systems. I think that this quote from Carl Jung encompasses a really important aspect of this project. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. But in this spirit, I think that New Age practitioners need to overcome their rejection of the dark side of their psyche. Investigate it, bring awareness to it, rather than pushing it away and externalizing it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. A lot of what people popularly consider to be spirituality has to do with with a kind of emotional hedonism that wants to whitewash all of the aspects of reality.
Yeah, so I think there's a tendency within the community to reify the spectrums of one's personal convictions and personal feelings, rather than to engage in an exploration of early people's proto-mimetic systems. And by proto-mimetic systems, I mean that before we had the capacity for paradigms, we had early cultural traditions, and one can engage in these cultural traditions in a broad empiricism sense of injunction, apprehension, falsification. That idea, by the way, comes from Ken Wilber's Summary of the Scientific Method, which he applies to other spiritual systems. As Aleister Crowley said, by doing certain things, certain results will follow, and that in turn is a great example of the philosophy of pragmatism. To do X is to know X, is to be X.
I think it's great that you mentioned pragmatism in this context, because if you go back to the origins of pragmatism, if you go back to figures like Peirce, he talked about how there isn't necessarily a difference between what gravity is and what gravity does. He was sort of trying to respond to the question of what's behind the scientific articulation of the laws of nature. You know, another thing I would connect this with is Husserl and with phenomenology, because the important insight in phenomenology is to kind of hold off making an epistemic judgment. And when we're talking about paranormal and otherworldly stuff like this, that ability to hold off making a epistemic judgment about what something is and what sense it exists is very important and helpful.
I would agree with you about pragmatism and holding off judgment. I think that so much of what one is experiencing is interpreted in the lens, semiotics, and dynamics of one's mind. I think with the paranormal, there is an epistemological basis or kernel and an ontology that otherwise falls outside of any observer's constructs of reality and mind. So, a cult, or a culture, or a cultus makes art about the metanatural, about the multiverse, including early cargo cults, where one could not identify the entirety of what one was looking at, as it falls outside of one's conceptual schema of reality and mind. And para and paranormal could be said to mean mediating between. So this could mean between the human animal and the divine, or it could be extended to epistemological and ontological pluralism, or it could mean the species umwelt, or it could mean the rendering of reality, as in the internal reality model of neuroscience, or it could mean radically not two, or having a non-dual experience. So with the paranormal, there's always this overlap between self and other. And within that overlap, there is an interpretive matrix, a kind of open question, a sort of arrangement or set of possibilities.
It's great to mention cargo cults, too, when we are talking about UFOs and extraterrestrial, or at least non-human, unidentified forms of intelligence. That's definitely something that's been discussed in some recent UFO literature. For example, Peter Levenda's book that he co-authored with Tom DeLonge. They basically allege that all of human culture and religion comes from early people's sightings of these unexplained things. And by the way, for those of us in the audience who aren't familiar with that term, cargo cult, it comes from some indigenous people in New Guinea who actually began to worship airplanes and refrigerators and to sort of create rituals around what they had seen some of the Americans and the Japanese doing as they were coming through the area in World War II. And those cults, those cargo cults, they still exist to the present day. And so what some UFO people believe is that this may have played a role in the origin of all religions. But possibly the major thing that's overlooking is altered states of consciousness, mystical experience.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying, and I agree with you. I think that physicalists today discount epistemology and ontology of early peoples given their constructs of paradigm, or strict eliminative materialism, and they discredit these constructs because they can't understand how reality is so skewed by the anthropomorphic, culturally conditioned, finite concepts of one's mind. So what I mean is, I think that physicalists discredit proto-knowledge because it's within pseudo-knowledge. And by the way, I think this has to do with the pre-trans fallacy, that the pre-rational and the trans-rational are hard for a rational agent to understand. There is also a kind of signal-to-noise ratio there, and one also has to account for a kind of contingency. Within cultural traditions, I think that there are early trans-rational concepts of aspects of mind that are beyond physicalism, namely that spirit is non-local, formless, acausal, empty, non-dual, luminous, primordial, and so forth. These are all qualities that are normally predicated of ultimate reality, but it's important to remember that these qualities do not contradict relative reality according to contemplative discipline. Perhaps cultural traditions offer unique assemblage points or vantage points or functions of consciousness that can only bring us so far as the map and territory. So this is a variation of perennialism which says that all traditions are grasping at the same truths, but instead of one universal truth, they may all have a different map or territory. Hinduism and non-dual mysticism is different from Buddhism, or the nanas and jhanas and direct perception of emptiness is different from mystical Christianity about the divinity of consciousness, forgiveness of sin, and transfiguration is different from the Tao, and principles of harmony and balance is different from shamanism and psychonautics, the use of trance, meditation, and entheogens to interface with aliens and spirits and other realms of consciousness, and so forth and so on.
So when you say all that about altered states of consciousness, I think it brings us back to our core theme, which is, in a sense, esotericism. Not everybody in the audience is going to be as familiar with that term, so very quickly, esoteric is the opposite of exoteric. The exoteric is what is open, what is known, what is obvious, what an ordinary person in an ordinary state of consciousness is prepared to grasp. Esotericism is what is concealed, hidden, what you either understand only if you have an extraordinary state of consciousness, or what can help you to get that extraordinary state of consciousness. And as a discipline, esotericism, either the study of historical esotericism or various types of esoteric practice, are about bringing you to the kind of place that you were just describing.
I think that there's an Overton window of acceptable discourse of either theism or atheism. Theism, I think, mistakes the art form, culturally conditioned, finite anthropomorphic concepts for other paradigms. and then often reifies this with a sense of eternalism, which is not to negate timeless aspects of consciousness, but which nonetheless is not able to provide a great map or territory of the phenomenology. Atheism is the extreme view of eliminative materialism. Physicalism has rationality, but does not account for spirit. Esotericism is sometimes that which falls outside of atheism or theism. It's neither one nor the other. But unlike the paranormal, there's less of an overlap of the other. The system is shrouded more in the cultural concepts of animal symbolicum, symbols, mythologies, folklore, traditions, and so forth. In New Age religion and Western culture, Groff defines the New Age as the emerging intersection between esoteric and secular worldviews. The New Age is defined as a form of cultural criticism or as that which is rejected, and therefore as spiritual counterculture. New Age is characterized by rejection of dualism, especially dogmatic Christendom, and rejection of reductionism or scientific worldviews of extreme eliminative materialism. It is also known for this worldliness and generative holism. These definitions are notable because the New Age is often used in a derogatory context to mean non-discernment, but in cross-comparative religious studies, the New Age typically means the whole movement of spiritual counterculture. We don't have paradigms coming out of sci-fi or New Age culture. The concepts that sci-fi New Age points to may very well need a new revolution of the differentiation of the value spheres all over again, and the separation of knowledge systems, and also the integral chart of interior and exterior domains, or subjective, objective, intersubjective, interobjective domains of knowledge. So such weird paradigms might seem AI or alien, or of another time period or species of the multiverse and so on, but I don't mean to seem anachronistic about mystical states and stages, or esotericism in general.
Yeah, I really like the fact that you're taking the time to point that out, because this project kind of maps a broad terrain between like psychedelic stuff and UFO stuff and historical esoteric stuff and stuff from like the contemporary cultic milieu. And some comparativist scholars would just lump that all under New Age. And, an unsympathetic listener would be like, that's a bad thing, like it's a put down. But it's not necessarily. Personally, I think that the only subculture that I've interacted with that is consistently open-minded is the New Age. And, for that matter, a lot of times I find esotericists, and, we're thinking of New Age as a subspecies of esotericism as being less dogmatic than scientism. And by the way, scientism, if you don't know that word, is a word for it's kind of a pejorative word for when someone takes currently accepted presuppositions, like, for example, materialism or reductionism, to be science itself, and then kind of becomes unscientific, if that makes sense.
I think that scientism is more religious than esotericism in a very strange sort of a way. And I think that it overextends its knowledge system into other knowledge systems and commits category errors of its own. And that there's often a sort of logical fallacy about how if one can't conceive of systems past physics, therefore these systems don't exist and one can't understand them. Mysterianism is the idea that human rationality simply cannot grasp certain fundamental truths about reality and consciousness. Now, I think psi, for example, would work on principles of translogical sciences and would defy our concepts of physicalism. To evolve psi and telepathy would mean to evolve into higher order logics or translogical capacities, theoretically at least.
Yeah, I think the idea of scientific revolution is critical there, like the way that Kuhn defined scientific revolution. Like there's a break between an old way of thinking and a new way of thinking, and you have to change your methods and you have to change your root metaphors. Whenever I think about stuff like psi or the UFO phenomena or other anomalous data. Something I remember is the two clouds that were on the horizon of physics at the beginning of the 20th century. And everybody said, oh, if you could just solve these two little, very minor technical problems, then physics would be done once and for all. And those two minor little problems turned into quantum mechanics and relativity. And I think in a similar way, the weird stuff that people are mostly ignoring now are the clouds on the horizon that, if you actually pay attention to them and you take them seriously, would lead to a revolutionary transformation in our understanding of reality.
When I think about higher order logics, I think about Bayesian predictive coding and predictive models, and non-Boolean concepts of complementarity. And these are concepts that have to do with neuroscience and simulation hypothesis. So, if paying attention to small anomalies led to revelations and revolutions in regards to quantum mechanics and relativity, so too paying attention to psi and paranormal could lead to vast-scale revolutions. So, tying this back to esotericism, if esotericism is animal symbolicum, trying to comprehend that which lies outside of itself and its own constructs of symbols and early peoples, so too the metaphors of new paradigms point just outside the constructs of this time period.
You know, what that brings to mind for me is a kind of negative dialectics, and specifically the Hegelian term of art, Aufheben, which has to do with to abolish, to sublate, and to also at the same time to transcend. And the movement of the dialectic is that the contradictions of one level give rise to the new emergent evolutionary possibilities of the later level. And perhaps that's a good place to leave it, because the triadic metaphysics of Hegel derives very much from the Western esoteric tradition, which of course informs the aesthetics and the substance of the reptilians that we have been ostensibly talking about, however abstractly.
If the Anglo-Saxon root of the word weird is weird with a Y, and describes often destiny or fate, such as a twist of fate, so too the higher order logics are equated with what Spinoza would say is God is nature, or giving it a liberal interpretation, supernatural as the natural. Leibniz's concept of God was that it entailed the best of all possible worlds. Gödel thought that God was necessarily so, with certain positive qualities. And so too Hegel's Geist, or spirit, which typifies German idealism, has both this construct of weird and higher order logics.
That reminds me of Whitley Strieber's interpretation of the close encounter phenomena and its meaning. He says that the close encounter phenomena is what the force of evolution would look like if it were applied to a conscious, intelligent creature.
That reminds me of Joe Rogan's description of DMT elves when talking to Dan Aykroyd. He describes them as complex geometries made of love and understanding. This is a little bit of a joke, so bear with me. If you combine the triadic movement of the Hegelian dialectic with Whitley Strieber's concept of evolutionary pressure, then the DMT elves are like the graphic user interface for the evolutionary potentials of consciousness.
All of this reminds me of the teleological vision that Wilbur offers at the end of Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. And he gives a kind of broad synthesis of Hegel, Gödel, and Nagarjuna. Very briefly, he says, every holon issues an IOU to the cosmos. In other words, it's all incomplete or uncertain. So at each phase of the temporal dialectical unfolding of spirit, there's a contradiction, which gives rise to and is resolved in the next level. But that has to go on forever, because in Wilbur's words, all IOUs can only be redeemed in infinity, or in emptiness.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us, and please stay tuned and stay connected. Talk to us in Discord, and we'll continue together on our strange journey.